My name is Cece. I am from the Sault Ste. Marie Tribe of Chippewa Indians in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Nice to have some support here in Oklahoma. Nice little contingent of Michigan people. So I am the Public Affairs Director for the association, and I have been there for almost 2 years now. And so I was really honored to open the conference with the journalist panel, and I'm really honored to close it with our Native author discussion tonight. And it just really means a lot to me to be up here with you guys. I started reading at a very, very early age. I was one of those kids that would use my nightlight to read, hence why I have glasses with a very strong prescription. So I'm very excited to be up here with the authors and with you and with everyone in Zoom land today. So I want to thank Green Feather Books. Heather is out there right at the entrance. She is a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation, and she is out there selling books by all these wonderful authors. And she's got this one by Andrea, Man-Made. She's got this one by Sarah Elizabeth Sawyer. And she's got more than this. I just wanted to play Vanna White. And Just Like Grandma by Kim Rogers as well. And I know that there's one too, A Letter for Bob. Great. We're going to put these on top of our fake fireplace now. Set decoration courtesy of this beautiful resort. Angeline, I'm sorry we don't have any of your books. They sold out.
It's a big problem to have.
So congratulations on that. Thank you so much. Oh, look at this. This is the people on Zoom are going to love this. Thank you. Okay, so let's get cracking and introduce everybody. So we have 4 talented Native women authors with us. Angeline Boulley is a citizen of the Sault Ste. Marie Tribe of Chippewa Indians and a New York Times best-selling author of Firekeeper's Daughter and Warrior Girl Unearthed. Kim Rogers is an enrolled member of Wichita and affiliated tribes and author of Just Like Grandma, A Letter for Bob, and I Am Osage, How Clarence Tinker Became the First Native American Major General. Andrea Rogers is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation and author of children's book Mary and the Trail of Tears, short story The Ballad of Maggie Wilson, and essay My Oklahoma History. We can do a round of applause. If I pause to take a breath there. Sarah Elizabeth Sawyer is a tribal member of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma and author of 17 historical fiction books, including Anumpa Warrior, Choctaw Code Talkers of World War I, and is the creator of the Fiction Writing American Indians digital course. Thank you for being with us for this special event. We're so excited to have you here tonight. I'm going to take a seat. Okay, so my first question, I know that I spoke about being a young reader, but I'm very curious about what sparked your fire to write, and did it begin at an early age? Angeline, do you want to take this one first? There's a microphone right behind you. We got to share mics.
Okay. I was always good at writing, and I would write in my diary, and I remember specifically writing this scene, and it was this girl and her friend died, and she's at the funeral, and there's like this big confrontation with the mother. I don't know, I was a very dramatic child. But, and this would break my mother's heart to know, but my mom read my diary, and then she like wrote in the next blank page, "You're very sweet and I love you very much." And I know she meant it in like the all the best intentions. But I just remember feeling so like violated and that my words weren't safe. And so I stopped writing. I didn't pursue writing as a career. I just, nope. And then I had my great idea for the story when I was 18. But it wasn't until I was 44 years old and going through a midlife crisis that I was like, okay, I think I'm gonna write. You know what? This story is just whispering the whispers have gotten so loud I cannot ignore. And maybe I am a storyteller and I'm ready to tell this story. So it took a very long time for me to come back to writing and feeling safe about that process.
Well, it was worth the wait.
Meet which.
Do you want to answer, Sarah? How did you begin writing?
Well, first of all, Yakoki, thank you, Cece and Shannon, for doing this wonderful Native Author event and inviting us up here. We really appreciate that, and asking these wonderful questions about where we started with our writing journey. Angeline, thank you for sharing that with your mom. I have a bit of an opposite story with that. My mother has been very encouraging, and I want to go ahead and acknowledge her. She's my road buddy and my researcher, assistant, and partner in everything that we do. And she traveled up here with me, and that's Linda K. Sawyer, and that's also who I have my Choctaw ancestry through. So at 5 years old, I had a story about kindness that I wanted to share, and I felt like it was a story that God put on my heart that I needed to share with people, but I was so shy. Like, if someone rang the doorbell, I ran and hid behind my mom's skirt because I was just scared to death of talking to people and being around people. So I knew in order to share this story about kindness that I would need to write it. And so my mom gave me a stack of sticky notes, and I wrote them in little one-sentence pieces. Not all the words were there, not all the spelling was there, but the story was there, and that story about kindness, and that's where it began for me. And I was looking at an article that was in our tribal newspaper, the Bishkanik, back in March, about influential Choctaw women, and they had featured me, and I was reading back through that, and there was a quote in there that I wanted to share. So a quote from me about me that I felt like was really appropriate though for this event. And so I moved into writing stories about my Choctaw ancestors and my fourth generation grandparents who walked the trail. And so I'd said, our ancestors walked the trail for us. They gifted us with a legacy of endurance, resilience, and faith that inspires me to this day. When I think of all they went through to give the Choctaw Nation a future, it kindles the fire in me to tell their stories.
Wow, that's very powerful. Thank you. I'm glad you got over your fear of being in front of a crowd.
Who said I'm not afraid?
Yeah, oh, okay. Well, we'll be very nice. Kim or Andrea, would you like to answer that question? How did you get started?
Yeah, this is on, right? You can hear me?
Yeah.
First off, I'd like to say thank you so much for the invite. I am so honored to be here with you all. I love all of your work, and it's just a pleasure and an honor to be here. So I first started writing when I was in the first grade. I wrote my very first poem when I was in the first grade, and I remember that day specifically because it was raining, and I wore rain boots and a raincoat to school. And when I got to school, I kept thinking about the rain outside. I was hearing the pitter-patter on the window outside, and I was smelling the rain, and it made me so emotional. And so I thought, I have to write this down. And so my teacher had given us an assignment, and it was on a piece of paper, and I wrote that poem down, and I drew a picture of a young girl with an umbrella, and I turned it into her. And when I got it back, she called me to her desk, and she said, Kim, I want to talk to you for a second. And she said, this is absolutely beautiful. I love this. So she was my first writing cheerleader, as I call her. And then in fourth grade, I wrote my very first story. I had a teacher, her name was Miss Maupin, and what she would do every week is she would have us write stories from our spelling words. And I absolutely loved doing that. It was so much fun. And she often had me read my stories in front of the class. And she was such a great teacher because she told me, she said, Kim, you're going to be a writer someday. And I laughed because I thought that adult jobs had to be miserable. It could not be fun writing like that. And so those two teachers had a huge, huge impact on my life. When I went off to college, I majored in 4 different things. I was still running from writing because I didn't think it was a real job. I majored in public relations, journalism, public relations. I worked at a college. I worked at different places. And I finally decided I want to write for children. It took me a long time to do that, to write from my own Native perspective. There were some things I had to work through personally to be able to do that. But I am so glad that I'm able to do that today. So, thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Osio Nagata. Andrea L. Rogers, Dawadoa, G. Chaliet. I am 54 years old. And the reason I mention that is because in the second grade, I knew I wanted to be a writer. My original plan was to be a softball superstar, but I got shot in the eye when I was 4, and I had a doctor at IHS that was like, you need to stay off the softball field. One ball to the eye and it's a stick and a dog for you for the rest of your life. So I had to change tracks. In my family, you if you were a girl, you got a softball scholarship to college. If you're a boy, you got a football or basketball scholarship. And so my dad, we grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and my dad was like, S.E. Hinton sold a book by the time she was 18. You could probably do that. And I loved to read. And so once I could no longer be a softball superstar, I decided I was going to be a writer. And that was in the second grade. And so I read everything. I read the cereal boxes. I read whatever was on the wall. I loved stories. My dad was an amazing storyteller. He was a musician. He taught himself to play guitar. And yet he was never interested, and he was a student of Dick West at Bacone. He was an amazing artist, and he actually never had any interest in monetizing anything. He just loved to tell stories. He loved to draw pictures. He loved to make art. He loved to play music. And so I loved stories. I loved reading. But I knew that when I went to the library, there were not going to be any books about my family. There were not going to be any books about the people who looked like me. There were not going to be any books about Indians after 1839. I didn't know that in second grade, but basically after we got removed on the Trail of Tears, apparently we went extinct. Did you know that? I found that out when we moved to Texas. When we moved to Texas, my kids would tell other kids in their class, I'm Indian, I'm Cherokee, and they were like, ugh, you can't be Indian, all the Indians are dead, we killed them all. And my kids would go, no, 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 I am. And so when I was a kid, there were no books by us, about us, after 1839. And so I have my first daughter when I'm 30, and the landscape has not changed. There's one book, or there's a couple of books by Cynthia Lytek Smith, Jingle Dancer, Indian Shoes, Rain Is Not My Indian Name, and that's it. And so that's not to say that there weren't tribal publishers publishing books in small amounts, but they were hard to find. I mean, they weren't in the Tulsa Public Library, not in the kids section. They weren't in the Dallas Library. I went to the Dallas Public Library and the Fort Worth Public Library, and librarians would hand me books and say, oh, this is by a Muskogee Creek writer, not Cynthia Lytek Smith. And I would read it, and I'd be like, no, it's not. So she might say she is, but she ain't. And so it took a long time to get over the imposter syndrome of being an actual Native person and feeling like it was okay to tell my stories. And what got me over it was having children. And something that's been interesting to me is in the recent horror anthology, Never Whistle at Night, is how many women are in there who are moms, who already have kids, who have reached a point in their life where they've already had careers and they are finally feeling like it's okay to tell the stories from their own point of view, that they no longer have to wait for someone to give them permission. So
Thank you. Oh, no, you guys can share that. Thank you for sharing your journey. Okay, so our next question, where do you draw inspiration for your stories? Are there specific cultural traditions, historical events, or personal experiences that kind of consistently find their way into your writing? we'll go with Sarah. Do you want to go first again, and then we'll go to Angeline?
All looking at me, sure. So my first book was Touch My Tears, Tales from the Trail of Tears, and I did that with 9 other Choctaw authors from 5 different states, and it was just a tremendous project for me. Several years ago, over a decade ago, we would go to the 5 Tribe Story Conference in Muskogee, and it was a marvelous gathering of Native authors and storytellers, and they would bring in, sometimes they would bring in a bus of elders, you know, a shuttle bus of elders, and they would come in and tell their stories, tell stories of going to Wheelock Academy in the 1940s, and they would just tell stories about their family and growing up. And I remember sitting there and going, who's writing these stories down? Who's preserving these stories? Like, they're going to be gone in the next decade or so. Whenever I applied for the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian Artisan Leadership Program, and I was accepted into that, that was my project, was to do Trail of Tears stories. So I went to DC, did the research, brought it back to my community, and combined with the history and all that we had in the stories, and gathered up several Choctaw authors who submitted stories for this anthology. And it just blew me away, the heart that they put into it and the work that they put into it, and the fact that several of them based it on their family stories, on their family Trail of Tears stories that had been passed down. And for me, with the Choctaws, the Trail of Tears is just still at the heart of our history. It's the heart of our people. It's that pivot point in our history that brought us, you know, to where we are today in the Choctaw Nation. And so I just, that, you know, ever since then, I just wanted to continue to draw on our history and just share the lives, the heartaches, the faith, the hope, the endurance of my people. And so I've written and their heroic deeds. I've gone from the Trail of Tears to the 1890s. I have a series set in that time period, right before the Dawes Commission. And then I paused that for a little bit to do the Choctaw Code Talkers of World War I, because, you know, as you were saying, Andrea, you would go into places and I would ask, like at museums and libraries, and I was speaking, you know, who's heard of the Navajo Code Talkers of World War II? And everyone raised their hand because of the movie. And I would say, who's heard of the Choctaw Code Talkers of World War I? And I would just get blank stares. And I was like, we've got to tell this story. And I knew the anniversary years were coming up of World War I back in 2016. And I really wanted to make sure that the Choctaws and the service that they did was acknowledged during that time period. So that's whenever I went for 2 years researching for my book, A Noble Warrior, Choctaw Code Talkers of World War I. And there were several other Native tribes who used their language in World War I as well, in addition to the Choctaws, and it really laid the foundation for the Navajo Code Talkers. So that's what I've just wanted to do with my stories, is to bring out the heart and the heroic deeds of our people. And now with my newest book, Otis W. Leader, he was a Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cherokee, Irish World War I hero, doughboy, right there, thank you, Angeline. And so he's also a handsome fella. I tell you, if he was alive today, whoa, I would propose to him. So he enlisted at age 35. He was a widower with 3 children, and was actually accused of being a German spy because of his mixed heritage. He looked very different and had Swedish bosses, and that landed him in trouble, and it riled him up, and he went and enlisted and was chosen by the French to represent the American doughboys when they landed. They said, who better to represent than an American Indian to represent the American soldiers? And he went on to fight in every major battle, and very much lived up to the title of the ideal American doughboy. So it's just an honor to pull out those stories and write them in fiction, and this is my first nonfiction book, so it's just a privilege.
Thank you.
Can you repeat the question?
Yep, I was just about to do that. Thank you. Where do you draw inspiration from your stories, and are there specific cultural traditions or historical events or personal experiences that consistently end up in your writing?
So, my stories have come to me in different ways. My first story was, you know, from personal experience. Many people have heard my origin story about, you know, this new boy, senior year, and then he ends up being an undercover police officer. And then I'm wondering, oh, what if I would have met him, and what if he needed my help, and my whole like Nancy Drew, anyway. And then my second book was so specific, the character came to me fully formed, and I knew exactly who she was. She knew exactly who she was. And so it's just been a different experience. Someday I will write a book about the stories behind the stories, and how I'm a different writer for each book. So, yeah.
I have noticed your use of language in your books too, and that consistently kind of finds its way.
It does. And so in my first book, Daunis, so her dad is Ojibwe and her mom's not Native, and so her use of Anishinaabe is she uses it to introduce herself at prayer, ceremony. She uses it in a very specific way, and that probably reflects my comfort level, because even though my dad was a first language speaker, he made a decision not to teach us, and he was doing it because he thought he was going to protect us from the BS that he went through being a brown-skinned Ojibwe in Sault Ste. Marie in the 40s and 50s. And so I don't have that fluent, I have that, I don't have that ear for it. But then in my second novel, Warrior Girl Unearthed, Perry has grown up fluent. And so my use of the language in that book is she has conversations with people. And so it's different, and I appreciate readers who are like, that they comment on that difference in the language. So yeah.
That's awesome. Thank you. So for you ladies, again, are there specific cultural traditions and personal experiences that kind of end up in your writing?
For me, it's all about personal experience. I tell kids the way that you write is you go out into the world and you experience it. And for me, that's how I write my books. My first book is called Just Like Grandma. It was illustrated by Julie Flett. Came out with Heartdrum, Harper Collins in January. And it's the story about a young Wichita girl who wants to be just like her grandmother. In my Wichita culture, and in a lot of Native cultures, we hold our elders in high esteem. They are the wisdom keepers. They are the ones that pass down stories and cultural knowledge. And I wanted to honor my grandmothers in this story. I wanted to show the special bond a granddaughter has with her grandmother. And that's why I wrote that book. My second book is called A Letter for Bob. And that book is based on personal experience as well. I was a sensitive child, and I'm still a sensitive adult. I've always been attached to cars. When I was 3 years old, my dad was stationed in Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. He was in the Marine Corps. My mom had just had our baby brother. I was 3 years old. My dad had the coolest green Camaro you've ever seen. I absolutely loved that car. I sat in the back seat. That back seat was mine. There was no baby brother to be found in that car. We took the car to the dealership, and my parents said we had to trade it in and get a more family-friendly car. And unfortunately, I think it was a station wagon, so that was not a cool car. And so I remember leaving that car at the dealership and looking out the back window, tears streaming down my cheeks. And this is a book about a little girl named Katie who writes a letter to Bob, the car, the family car, thanking him for the memories, basically. And so that's what this story is about. And I think this is good for kids because it's a good way to think about grief. Kids have to let go of things, and this is a book that helps kids with grief. And I still am not looking forward to the day that I trade my little SUV, white SUV named Daisy in. I'm going to have to read my own book for that. The third book that I have coming out is called I Am Osage, How Clarence Tinker Became the First Native American Major General. I come from a military family. 6 of my family members had been stationed or worked at Tinker Air Force Base. I did research at the Oklahoma Historical Society. I was doing research on something totally unrelated, and I stumbled upon General Tinker's bio. I found out that Tinker Air Force Base was named in his honor, and I found out he was Native. He was specifically Osage. My husband still works on base as a contract worker. He's retired. He was in the military for years. And I said, "Have you ever heard of Clarence Tinker?" And he said, "No." I asked around, nobody else had heard of Clarence Tinker. And so I wanted to write a story to recognize this unsung military hero. And that's why I wrote this book. So every single book I write has something to do with my own life and personal experience.
Wow, that's great. I feel similar to you, not about the car, but about the house I grew up in. I still love that house, and I feel like I should write a letter to that house now. Thank you. Andrea?
All right. So every story I think I've ever written is somehow tied to my family or my history or my experience. And sometimes I don't even know that until later. And so when I wrote Mary and the Trail of Tears, I wrote, oh, it's not up here. Anyway, so, but it is at the booksellers. Anyway, so when I wrote that, I had talked to a genealogist, and I was like, I mean, the Cherokee were all over the South. And so I had to figure out a place to start the removal. Where did we get kicked out of? And my Twyla Barnes said, well, start where your family was from. And I was like, what? And so, so I did. So I backtracked through my own genealogy, and so found that we were on one side of the family, we were near Ross's Landing. And she said, well, the Taylor detachment, the Buttrick Journal, is really good. And that's what we give the Remember the Removal writers. And it's written by a white missionary who chose to go with the Cherokee. And it's an excellent record of what happened during removal. And so I used the Buttrick Journal as the skeleton for my 10 chapters, because I had to get from where we got moved out of our cabins, moved out of our houses, where our things were taken, where people were killed if they didn't move fast enough. And I had to write about that for 8-year-olds. And so I used Buttrick's journal as the skeleton. And then I actually found out about 2 weeks ago that my family, the Lowrys, Switcher Lowry, was on the Taylor detachment. And so I think there are things that we know. We don't know how we know them, but we know them. And so everything I write about is related to family stories, family memories, family names, family history. And so it's also related to the fact that there are so many things that other people don't know about us. As I said, when we were living in Texas, people were telling my kids that we were extinct. Well, I moved to Texas when I was a little bit over 30, and I had no idea that Chief Bowles and his tribe had been massacred there. And I actually do have an ancestor who's probably a Texas Cherokee. Her name was Susie Spaniard. She's a descendant of the Spaniard. She shows up in Cherokee Nation and running liquor. And so, and then, my great-grandfather marries her. And so I actually probably had people there, but I didn't know anything about it. And if I didn't know anything about it, then how could I expect the other people in this continent to know anything about it? And so when I started writing, I started Man-Made Monsters 21 years ago. And I always called the family the Wilsons, just because I knew that my great-grandfather was called Wilson, until he added the name Rogers when he got out of prison. Anyway, and so everything was related somehow to family stories. And what I didn't realize when I was writing these stories is how universal those individual stories can be. How we often have very similar stories, or we have very similar feelings or very similar experiences. And there's so much community building available and being able to share those stories and talk about them. Being able to pick up a book and say, oh my gosh, we have the same story in our family. Oh my gosh, the same thing happened to my grandfather. My grandfather was in World War I. And so he was a doughboy. He handled the horses in France at the Meuse-Argonne. And so people didn't know about that, though. I mean, as you said, you know, people knew about the Navajo code talkers, but they didn't know about the Cherokees talking about turtles, right? The tanks. And people didn't know about that. And so those were all stories that were just, I mean, in my family, we all knew. And so we all knew we knew. And yet, for other people, those were new things. And so everything I wrote, I think really is, it's a love song to my family. It's a love song to my tribe. It's also a love song to the rest of humanity because it helps me express who I am as a human being, who my people are, who my family are, but also sort of the universality of who we want to be as human beings, right? Which is like Native people are not, we're not props, we're not cameos. I mean, we're just as real as everyone else, and our cultures are just as valid, and we shouldn't have to explain everything. So.
Thank you. Yeah, it sounds like each of you really weave in the cultural side, the historical side, and then all of you have a deeply personal experience and a compelling need to write. And so that's very interesting. Thank you for sharing that. Our next question is, how do your stories contribute to the preservation of your cultural heritage? Do you see your work as a form of advocacy or activism?
Y'all keep looking at me. It's because I have notes, right?
Yeah. We like someone who comes prepared.
I did this because I came in from a week of taking my cousin to chemo in Richardson, so I wanted to make sure that I had some notes and kind of keep things straight. She's doing very well, though.
Okay,
so
good.
But I love this question. I do see my stories as heritage fiction or preservation fiction. My mother, Linda Kay, coined the term that we are artist preservationists. We are really using our art, her through her photography and beadwork and painting, and me through stories. So really seeing that through art we can preserve our history and culture, and really the artist of all our tribes, we are the preservationists. A lot of times we are the culture keepers and the memory keepers for our people. So doing that deep research and drawing from family and all, I think is so important when we're doing our art. I think it's important to go to the locations. That's something that I've been to our homelands in Mississippi. I've been to our sacred sites. I've been to the river where Toshpa, one of the stories that we found, the true stories where they crossed on the Mississippi River. I've researched in Arkansas, Mississippi, Missouri, just all over Washington, D.C., France. I did get to go to the battlefields in France where those doughboys were. Incredible experiences. I got to see the portrait that was done of Otis W. Leader that's still there at the Army Museum. And so just getting to find those things that the average person doesn't get to do. And I like what you said, Andrea, it's like a love letter to humanity. It's getting to share those with people that otherwise wouldn't know. They're just buried in archives. They're buried in family stories, and being able to bring out our culture in story and share it with the general population is just so important to me. I love how, our books can go around the world, to all these cultures. There's a great deal of fascination in, say Europe with American Indians. There's a lot of misconceptions. When we were driving around in the countryside in France, and we were trying to find the hill where the code talkers, the Choctaws, did their code talking. And so we drove up to the little village of Vonk, and we drove around and around trying to find the monument that they said was there, not to the code talkers, but to the battle. And there was this couple out in their yard, so we stopped, and our tour guide, who was just marvelous, he began telling them the story of the Choctaws in French. And I really appreciated that. Everywhere we went, everywhere he encountered, he made sure he told them about the Choctaws Choctaw Code Talkers. And so he was telling that, and the woman responded with something, and they kind of laughed, and he went, no, telephone. And we were like, what? And he said, oh, she wanted to know if they use smoke signals to to send the messages. And he's like, no, the telephone. So just those opportunities, it's a chance for us to share our culture, to correct some stereotypes. And that's, again, why I write the books that I write and try to be as culturally and historically accurate as I can, because I know this may be the only way people are learning about our people, and I want them to learn through, I feel like we can influence through entertainment, and that's what I'm really doing, especially with my historical fiction. So I think that answered the question. So that's what I wanted. It's preservation.
Oh, okay.
I'm going to jump in because I do not want to be the last word on this, because I actually end up quoting Angeline about half the time. And so I'm going to jump in and say, when we had our conversation about what we were going to talk about tonight, one of the things that hit me like a lightning bolt is I think that what we're doing as writers is we are repatriating Native literature. And maybe you would
Woohoo!
maybe you would say rematriating, because what we're doing, we are finally at a point where Native people are getting to tell their stories, where some people are noticing that, we have a legitimate claim to being the authentic voices. Instead of other people telling our stories, we are finally in a position where we are doing it. And some of us have had careers. Some of us have taken $20,000 pay cuts in order to go back to school and have the time to write after we've had 3 children. That would be me, I guess. Anyway, and I'm not bitter. Anyway, and so we are trying to set the record straight. We're telling our own stories. These are our stories. This is our cultural inheritance, and we should be the ones to tell them. And so I really see what we're doing as writers now as repatriating our Native stories, our Native literature, telling our stories. And so I love Angeline's book, Warrior Girl Unearthed, because on my second book, I was like, I'm writing about art thievery, right? But she's writing about something that, there are all these burning topics that we want to tell you everything. We want to get in your face and go, okay, but what about ICWA? What about repatriation? What about funerary objects? What about the fact that some things are stolen and then they're given away, or they're sold and they're in basements? We want to tell you everything, but one of us can't do it all. And so her second book, I was like, oh God, yes, thank you. Thank you for writing this, because it does matter. It matters to me where my people's bones are. It matters to me that objects are not stolen. It matters to me that artists are given credit for the work they do. And so I think as writers, we're finally getting to a point where Native people actually get to write their own stories, and I think that's important.
Thank you. Yeah, that's powerful words. I never really thought about it that way. So thank you. That's powerful advocacy work. Kim, would you like to go?
And as far as advocacy goes, that's what I do with my own writing. Just like everybody else, when I was growing up, I never saw myself in a book. And of course, our history isn't told past 1900, and a lot of people still think we're not here. And just thinking about, as a child, not seeing yourself in a book and not really realizing it until you're older. I couldn't really articulate that until I was older. When I was a child, I ran in the land run. My parents didn't know any better. They wanted us to fit in and do what everybody else was doing at school. And so I have written a poem. There's a poem that I've written. It's coming out in an anthology sometime next year, and I'm looking forward to sharing that with everybody. But I never want a kid to feel like I did, erased. I never want a kid to have to run in the land run who's Native. I want kids to see themselves in books. It's so, so important that we're represented.
Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop wrote an essay, I believe it was in the late 60s or early 70s, and she was an educator, and she wrote that books for children and teens can serve as windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors by which every child should be able to see themselves reflected in the pages of a book, or to be able to peer into the lives of people very different from themselves, and through the safety of the pages of a book, to be able to step through and experience lives very different from our own and connect with our humanity. And Dr. Debbie Reese, who runs the American Indians and Children's Literature blog, she has taken that windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors analogy and has said, some of those windows need curtains. When I was, the 10 years that I was drafting Firekeeper's Daughter, some of those drafts, I shared so much about the culture because I was coming from a place of, I wasn't raised on the res, my dad didn't teach us the language, and so I wanted to prove that I know, and here I'm gonna like give you every detail about ceremonies and about, you know, being Native. I'm gonna tell you everything. And I'm glad that I did not get published with those earlier editions, and that by the time, you know, wisdom and age and, you know, life experience, I realized that value of pulling that curtain. And so by the time I was writing the final draft of Firekeeper's Daughter, I knew the value of pulling that curtain, and not everyone has a right to our indigenous knowledge. And I felt like a caretaker of that. So I would have a scene fade to black instead of going into the sweat lodge. I created a pansy ceremony as part of a healing thing because I did not want to include an actual ceremony. And so I'm very thankful that it took me as long as it did so that I could write the story that really was meant to be shared. And I ended up with a mantra that I still use today, and it's, I write to preserve my culture, and I edit to protect it.
Wow. Thank you. All right, so this is kind of one of my, I've been looking forward to asking this question, one of my favorites. So some artists begin with a blank canvas or a block of clay, and they create entirely intuitively without a predetermined outcome. They know that their work is done when they can neither add nor remove anything. And other artists have a specific vision of what they want their finished piece to look like. That being said, how would you describe your writing process? Let's start with Kim this time. Give the ladies on the end a break.
For me, every book is different. For Just Like Grandma, I had a vision in my head about a relationship between a granddaughter and her grandmother. I sat down at my laptop, and bits and pieces of that story came to me, and it took a little time to write. With my second book, A Letter for Bob, it took me 2 years to think about that book. I did not sit down at the page. It was completely different. And so by the time that I did sit down, that story poured right out. It's weird that that happens. That's very rare. It didn't have a whole lot of editing done to it as well, because I knew what that story was going to be, because 2 years is a very long time to think about a story. And the third one, I think I started writing that in 2017. I did a lot of research, and with that book, I wrote it probably 25 different times. And I'm not talking sentences change, I'm talking complete structure change, complete through line change. It was completely a different book. It took me a very long time to get that book right. That's probably the most difficult book I've ever written. I have more things coming out. I have a fourth book. That one, is different as well. I went on a writing retreat at a beach on the Pacific Northwest, and I remember trying to figure out that book, and I remembered going for a walk on the beach, and I stood there by myself, and it has to do with the ocean and different sounds, and I stood there on the beach, and I heard this sound, and this one word came to me that put the whole book in motion. So that was a very serendipitous thing that happened. So for me, every single book is different, and it's very organic in how it comes out. There's no way that I can tell any writer, you write a book this way or that way. Every book is different, like I said.
What was the one word?
Crescendo.
Angeline, so she said 2 years is a long time to think about a book. How do you feel about that?
Well, yeah, I've got you beat. So I have like a 37-year process from spark of idea to when it actually hit the shelves. But I agree so with you that each book is different. I am a different writer. I'm working on my third book. My writing process for my first, very much early morning. I was married. I had 3 kids. Like, I would wake up a half hour before the kids got up, and that was, I'd have a cup of coffee. I'd be writing on the family computer. That was my creative time. You know, my second book, I had 1 year to write it instead of 10. And I ended up like reverting back to my old grant writer habits. I would be pulling all-nighters. You know, if the writing wave, if that muse visits you, I believe that you ride that wave until she leaves you. You don't tell her to go or that you're tired. You just follow her lead. My third book, I'm on deadline for it, and I'm a completely different writer each time. Each situation is different. And my dad, people are always asking authors for writing advice for emerging writers. And I say to them, my dad always told me we were the first environmentalists. We only took that which we needed, and we would leave the rest behind for someone else. And I feel that way about writing advice. When someone says something or you latch onto something, there are some times when it just hums. It just like, yep, it resonates. And if it doesn't resonate with you, that's okay. Leave it for somebody else. It might resonate with them. And so it's very much this intuitive and very trusting. When the story comes, trust it. And it's coming through you for a reason. And so I consider that an honor.
I do. Yeah, exactly what they said. I will tell you that I have 3 children. They were all induced. And so nothing moves me like a deadline. And so with my first book, that was a work for hire for Capstone, Marrying the Trail of Tears, part of the contract was I had to produce a 10-page outline, and the plan had to be for those, not a 10-page, sorry, 10-chapter outline, and it had to basically meet the structure of all the other books in the series, because it was a series book. And so I had, in order to, meet my contractual obligations, I had to give them a 10-chapter outline. And so I did. And that was hard because I was trying to follow the actual timeline of the Trail of Tears. And for the tailored attachment, it was basically 11 months. And so how do you get 11 months into 10 chapters? But you also have to include what led up to the Trail of Tears. So you've got to do some squishing and some moving around. And so in order to meet the obligations, I created a 10-chapter outline. And that was the fastest thing I've ever written because I had an outline. But I also, and it was historical fiction. And I also knew who I was writing for. I was writing for children 8 and up. The work had to be, it had to be historically accurate, but it also had to be appropriate, age appropriate. And so it also had to be something that I felt like my ancestors would be okay with. it had to be something that, as Brian Young says, is medicine for the community. And so I had to feel good about it when I finished. And that was the fastest thing I've ever written, because I had that outline and I had those very specific goals. Now, when I was writing Man-Made Monsters, I wrote, it took 21 years. So my first story I wrote in 2001. And then couldn't get, I won an award at a Dallas Public Library event, but then I couldn't get it published. And so I kind of just put it in a drawer. And then, 10 years later, my best friend and I were just giving each other writing prompts. And so I wrote another story that ends up in the book. And then I went to IAI and I wrote 13 of the stories. And so deadlines are amazing. And so then my next book, I've been thinking about it for 10 years. My next book is The Art Thieves. And then in the meantime, I'd written all these little picture books because I had kids. And so I'd write these little picture books, which I thought, oh, well, here, I'd write about the zoo. I'd write about the national parks. I'd write about a Shakespeare play. I'd write about picking wild onions. I'd write about Choochelt, which is, an annoying little brother driving his sissy crazy. And so I'd write all these other little books, and they would just sort of happen. And I could write them really quickly. It's the craft of the revision, right, which might take longer. The protecting the culture, the protecting children, the building up children, the helping young people, just like supporting young people, right? Letting them see themselves in ways they haven't seen them before. So Man-Made Monsters, it's a horror novel. But in my horror novel, the bad guys are the human beings, not necessarily the werewolves. And the most important thing for me was making sure that, if you watch horror movies, the first person who dies is brown, usually, right? And so I wanted to write stories that portrayed a future where we live, where we survive, where young brown women make it home alive, and they're stronger, and they're part of their community.
How would you describe your writing process, Sarah?
As a mess. It really, and I echo so much of that. It is a years-long process, multiple years often. I've got 18 books out now, and people are like, "Where do you get your ideas?" And I'm like, "They're everywhere." They're just constant stream, constant inspiration. And usually, though, it usually either starts with a historical event or it starts with a character. So for Trail of Tears, it started with the historical event. With my Choctaw Tribune series, it started with the characters, this brother and sister pair who own a newspaper in 1890s Old Choctaw Nation. And I really connect with those characters because they're writers and they're fighting for the truth and all of these things. So generally, though, I have those ideas, the seed of an idea or historical event that I want to write about. The Code Talkers, I wrote a flash fiction about it, probably, I think it was like 2012 maybe or something, and it wasn't until 2018 that I did my novel. So I had wanted to, and even before that, I'd wanted to write about the Code Talkers. So it was many, many years of just thinking about them. And my biggest hang up was, do I do a fictional character or do I do it from the viewpoint of one of the actual Code Talkers? And I did that with Toshaba's story. I wrote it in first person from him as a young boy crossing the trail. It was based on a true story, but I fictionalized, but I went through his point of view. I didn't feel comfortable with doing that with the Code Talkers because there were descendants who were still alive who knew these men. They were their grandfathers, their great uncles, and so I wanted to respect, their points of view and their, when we're writing, we get deep into the internal conflicts and emotions and all, and I felt like I needed to do that as a fictional character. So it's just thinking through all of those things and praying through it, that it can just take years, and you're coming up with scenarios and then you're trashing them and then you're coming up with new ones and trashing them until you get to something that I feel like I'm taking thousands of words of notes. I'm reading research books before I finally sit down and write an outline. So specifically, I usually write a little skeleton outline, And then my last 11 books I wrote by dictation, solely by speaking, which is really neat for me. It took a lot to train my brain. In fact, I'm teaching writers through a boot camp, a virtual boot camp, twice a year now on how to do dictation, because it's a total different shift than typing our words. But for me, it's really neat because it kind of goes back to the tradition of oral storytelling, of speaking our stories. And so it's been, I've really loved the process, and now that it's incorporated into my writing. So I dictate my first drafts, and then it's the edit, which is my least favorite, but that's when I'm really checking the history, checking the research, and making sure that I have the accuracy. I'm running it through editors and beta readers, and so it's a very messy process at the beginning, lots of crazy notes all over the place, and getting it to that final draft. And they say write the book that you want to read, because you're going to read it 10,000 times before it gets published. So definitely need to be in love with the story and the characters, and be willing to receive feedback and critique and good edits on those. And there's a saying that's actually applied to artists, but we say it among writers too, is that a manuscript's never finished, it's just finally abandoned.
Wow.
And yeah, I want to add that when you're writing like this for publishers, it's also like when you can drag it out of your editor's hands. And so there could be a point where you're just like, oh my God, let it go, Nick. Let it go. Anyway.
So I will say on Chickasaw Press, I had a marvelous experience working with them. So shout out to the awesome team at Chickasaw Press. They did an amazing job. They did an amazing job on the production of this book and the trailer, just everything. My editor, Tori, was awesome. So in terms of speed, again, years process with my Doc Beck Westerns. I put that together in about 5 weeks, and it features an Omaha Indian woman doctor as the main character, set in the 1890s. And I wrote the first draft of the novella during Snowmageddon, so that 1 week I dictated it. So sometimes it goes really fast. Chickasaw Press, I told them I could have the draft to them in like 4 to 6 months, because I'd already done enough of Warrior. I'd already done a lot of research, and they were like, that fast? They're like, hold on now, we got to get it together now. But so that was actually a really fast book. That's probably one of my fastest books. And people have asked me which is easier, fiction or nonfiction. Nonfiction's easier.
I cannot read my books. Once I get that payment for upon delivery and acceptance, I'm done. Because I can't read the finished book, because I see every error, I think to myself, oh, if I could have just had one more round of revision. But I know myself. I could have 10 more years of revision, and I would still be finding things. And so at a certain point, I do have to abandon it. And I'm thankful that I love audiobooks, daughter of a truck driver. I mean, we were listening to audiobooks on cassette tapes. And so my audiobook is the only way that once it's published, my audiobook is the only way I can enjoy my story, because it's not my voice. It's this incredible narrator, and I can get lost in the story in a way that I cannot with my book.
Wow. It sounds like, just listening to all of you explain your process, it sounds like the process is very creative for each of you, and it varies from story to story, person to person, time in your life. So there's a lot of creative, within that. And it seems like there's no wrong way to begin writing, right?
Right. Well, I mean, if you've had children or taught a class full of children, you have to teach the kid in front of you, not the kid you want. Right? Necessarily. You have to teach the kid in front of you. And it's the same thing with having children. I mean, I have 3 children, and I'm apparently still not an expert. And it's like every single one has to be, you do everyone differently. The things you give the first child, they didn't want, the second child would have liked to have them. And the third child has no interest in any of it at all. And they would prefer to raise themselves. And so it's the same thing with the books. I mean, you might write one book, but the second book is going to be written differently, probably.
Okay, so I'm going to ask one more question, and then we're going to turn it over to the audience in Zoom for questions. So throughout your writing career, how have your stories and characters impacted you? Have your characters taught you anything surprising? Who wants to take this one first? Angeline?
I'm in awe of my characters, and in my first book, there's a character named Stormy, and he reminded me of my son's best friend growing up. He reminded me of former students. I had thought the story was going to go a certain way, and that this character of Stormy was going to be caught up in this drug cell. And then I just couldn't see that. And I was inspired by the pictures of, I saw a black and white or a sepia toned photo of boarding school with a fence around it and teepees of parents who would drum and sing outside of those fences to let, hopefully, that their prayers and their songs might be heard. And so for Stormy's ending, you know, he is incarcerated because he won't comply with the court with saying anything. He shuts down, and he is in custody. And his mother and father, who were not the most stable people throughout the book, but at the end of the book, he has an intact family. They know their culture, their language. They're there with him outside the perimeter of this facility, and they're singing and praying for him. And yeah, so I just, the characters talk to you, and it's the best honor, and you just listen. And the story, you think you're in control of the story, and you're not. And once you realize that, it opens up a whole new story that you're telling.
Kim, I saw you nodding along to that. What would you like to add?
Yes, and as far as like my first book, Just Like Grandma, when I sat down to write it, I did not know that story like I did for the second book that I wrote. And I was actually surprised that it flipped and Grandma wanted to be just like Becca. I did not know that. And so when I found that out, it just really touched my heart, because I thought about my own elders and my own grandparents, and they're saying to me, because they're no longer with us, but they're saying to me, Kim, we want to be like you too. We wanted to be like you. And so that was really heartfelt and meaningful to me. But I can tell you right now that the third book was the most impactful. And I wish I could tell you what the author's note says, but Clarence Tinker is basically the reason why I started writing Native literature. He had a huge impact on my life. And my editor says, Kim, I cannot read this author's note without crying. It is very raw and vulnerable, and I'm a little scared to put it out into the world, to be quite frank with you. But I'm really looking forward to everybody reading that, and you'll find out what I mean by that. So, thank you.
Sarah, do you want to go next?
I'm looking forward to reading that. Oh, I really am. And so Native warriors has been a big theme with doing an Upper Warrior and doing Otis's story. And I call him Otis because he just feels like a friend after so much time in his life. But characters that always surprise you. They don't go the direction that you think. And I do learn from each of them. And one of the things that will surprise me a lot of times is when I see myself in them, or whenever I'm going on the journey with them and I'm experiencing what they are experiencing and realizing some of the things that's reflecting deeper in my life that I might not even have realized was there and that needed to be expressed. So that's something that I really appreciate about writing. But specifically with doing the warriors, doing military, I don't come from a military background. My dad was drafted 3 times for Vietnam. They kept throwing him back because he weighed 100 pounds. And but we've always just had a great respect for our veterans, for our military service. And so I was very apprehensive writing, though, about from a military perspective and walking those battlegrounds through story with that, and just really coding that in prayer of like, can I do this? Do I have I have a great responsibility in doing this and in walking their shoes on the battleground. And something that someone told me, one of my very, very faithful, loving readers, as I was working through this and asking for, just that encouragement and prayer that I would do this and do it well and do it in a way that honored and respected our military warriors. And one of my dear readers said, "Sarah, you are a warrior for your people." And that just always stayed with me. So that's something that, in connecting with the characters is, just having that connection. I really appreciate that. But yeah, so many things with the characters. So love that question.
So I went to the Annie Leibovitz exhibit at Crystal Bridges recently. And so there's one room where it's full of books that are from her bookshelves, and photography books and art books. But there's a quote on the wall that says, "A thing that you see in my pictures is that I was not afraid to fall in love with these people." And when I read that, I thought, God, that's what I love in art, is that, you can see, Kim is in love with Tinker, but not in a icky way, right? A passionate way, right? And Angeline's women are bad. Those girls are badasses, and the aunties are badasses. And I'm thinking from Sarah's work too, it's like how much we love them and how much we want you to love them too, and we want to share their stories. And that's what I think, something about art, and that's why I loved Annie's work, is because you can see how much she appreciates these human beings, and she wants to show you what is the best of them, right? And I think that's something that, as Native writers and talking about repatriation, is for so long, Native writing has been about trauma porn. And I would argue that it's still very sellable. It's still out there in the films and the books, and it's something that we really have to push back against, because there's so much more to us. And so writing from a point of view of loving who we are and loving our culture and recognizing that, yeah, we're human beings. All human beings are flawed. But what is it that we have that provides us strength to go into the future and write a future that is better than what can be imagined now based on the way the world is now? And so having warrior girls, having women, having aunties, having people who respect those human beings is so important. And I think that's what I appreciate most in art. That's what I appreciate most in our stories. That's what I'm grateful for in having a culture to fall back on that said, hey, this is how you have balance. And it's not by being, the individual who is on top with all the money. It's by having a strong culture. It's by taking care of each other.
Oh.
Yeah, we do love your characters, and we're so grateful that you wrote them and that you share them with us, aren't we? All right, so we're going to take some questions. Do we have any questions on Zoom right now, Shell, while we kind of give everybody a chance in here to formulate their thoughts?
Well, no, but I have something. I just want to say thank you for the Clarence Tinker thing. Ironically, we were just talking about Clarence Tinker. You guys,
She's over there.
Yeah, hi. Kim,
She's running our Zoom for us. Thank you so much.
Sorry, it's gonna blow your mind, but that's actually one of the endeavors that we're working on right now for with Commemorative Air Forces, to open up an Indigenous area for the Rise Above section, which focuses on the Tuskegee Airmen and the Women Air Force Service pilots. And we have been advocating for Indigenous stories. So you guys telling these stories, you can bet I'm going to be hitting you up to be able to work with us on the film project that goes with that traveling exhibit. So I just wanted to thank you guys, because it's so important for the kids to get these stories as well as adults, so that they can see these stories lifetime. And now that we finally have a microphone, there you go.
questions from the audience, just raise your hand and we'll bring you a microphone. These ladies will be signing their books out here with Heather at the bookstore. So if you want to buy another book, sign it, get your picture taken, all that good stuff. We will be doing that afterwards. Oh, we got a question. Great.
Okay, my question is, how many more books would you guys like to write?
Repeat that.
How many more books would you guys like to write?
I'm under contract for 2 more. And then
I know yours, because
well,
yesterday.
and then I have an idea for a book that maybe is like part memoir and part craft. And by that time, I'm going to be into my like early to mid 60s. So I think that's kind of where I see it.
Anybody else want to answer that?
I don't think I'll live long enough to write all the books that I have. I have multiple series, ideas, and stories. So great question. I've got 2 series in the works, and yeah, they're just stories everywhere. So, and there's a lot of history and culture that we haven't written about yet.
Yeah, for me, I've got a lot in the works. There's really no telling, and I'm just like she is. I don't know how many books and how long I'll be alive to be able to do all of them. There are ideas everywhere, book ideas everywhere that we will never, ever be able to get to.
So a book is a container, but there are all kinds of containers. And so, I'm thinking about plays, I'm thinking about puppet shows, I'm thinking about movies, I'm thinking about a Netflix series, 3 years, 6 to 8 episodes, or YouTube, Apple, I don't know.
Speak it into existence. I love that.
I've loved the Apple originals, so, I don't know. I mean, I'm going to make up shit till I'm dead.
That's great. Any more questions on the? Okay, we've got one. Oh, Frank's got one.
Yeah, I'm curious. I know when you're working on something yourself, you've got your own thoughts about what it is, and once it's gone, it's in the minds of the readers. And I'm just curious, what surprising things have any of you gotten back as feedback about any of your books from readers? Things that you never anticipated that they might have gotten out of any of your books.
I'm going to jump in. So Man-Made Monsters is YA, and it's horror, but it's also sci-fi, and it's got ghosts and werewolves and all that sort of thing. One thing that surprised me was that adults will tell me the first chapter gave me nightmares, but kids don't tell me that. Kids they're not losing any sleep, so.
Wow, tough generation. I'm kind of scared now.
I'm trying to pull up a specific thing. I know I've had that before. What always gets me is when someone's like, wow, that was amazing how that character fit in with that plot and that twist, and I didn't know they had that in their background and that this was going to come together like that, and that was just amazing how you did that. And I was like, I did? Yeah, we'll go with that. Yeah. That's what I did.
Similarly, I was doing a book event, and someone in the audience said, Firekeeper's Daughter is written in first person point of view, present tense. And she said, but there's one of her dream sequences that's written in the past tense. Why did you choose to do it for that one? And I was like, oh, wait. I'm like, yeah, copy editing must have missed this. And then I was like, really? And then I'm like, well, dreams kind of exist outside of the, time and space continuum. And I think I just wanted to convey that otherness.
That's great. You got to think on the fly sometimes.
The great spiral of time.
And for me, what has been so surprising, but also just so warms my heart, is people coming up to me and telling me about their own relationships with their grandparents, their grandmothers. I love hearing those stories. It sparks a lot of stories for adults, and I really, really love hearing that.
That's awesome. Any other? Oh, we got a question back there.
We have one in Zoom as well, and then we'll bounce back there.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Karen Stevens is asking, beyond purchasing and promoting books authored by Native writers, how might archaeologists, universities, museums, and similar institutions further contribute to the support of Native writers?
You have that.
Oh boy.
Well, no, but your land acknowledgement response. I think it's really your land acknowledgement response.
Oh. Yeah, like back to what I had said yesterday about land acknowledgements and, having a call to action, because you can say that you support Indigenous storytelling, that you support own voices, or writing from lived experience, but really it comes down to that call to action of read Indigenous authors, and it doesn't have to cost you anything. We get a perk when libraries have a waiting list that's so long that they have to get another book. Like, we see that benefit. Don't feel like, oh, I couldn't afford your book. I'm sorry. No, request it from your library for free. And then once you do so, read it, rate it, review it, recommend it to friends. That's like action you can take that benefits all of us, and it lets publishing know that our stories are marketable, that they're,
They matter.
that they matter.
Yeah. And so, as she said, so call your libraries. call, most of us have cell phones, and long distance is free. Call any library and tell them, oh, you need to buy this book. It doesn't cost you anything.
And look into things. So Firekeeper's Daughter was selected as the Great Michigan Read book, and I'm the first Indigenous author that got picked for this, and it's through the Michigan Humanities Council. And so they have a thing where, through the Michigan Public Library, that if you have an IP address that links back to Michigan, you can download a free ebook or audiobook of Firekeeper's Daughter. And so look into things like that. Request ARCs from publishers from Indigenous authors.
And, if you have spare funds, buy a couple of books buy a classroom set for
Christmas is coming up. Books make a great gift.
And so, buy a set for a teacher that, was a favorite teacher of yours who would be, who would appreciate it and share it with their class. Mary and the 12 Tears, it's $8 for a paperback. So, yeah. So
Talk about it on social media.
That's less than 2 Starbucks coffees.
Yeah, go ahead. Say
Yeah, talk about it on social media. I have a museum on the Northwest Coast, Kimberly, and every time there's a book club discussion on all these different book groups, and they're like, hey, I'm looking for Indigenous authors. She's like, go read Sarah's books, here's this. And so just constantly, sharing it on there, writing articles and putting it on, your museum or archives website, interviewing the author. That helps with search engine recognition and all of those things. So just getting their name online is really helpful. Our names.
Yeah, what I would
Spelled
also
correctly.
say... Spelled correct, yes. I would also say that I think a way that museums and archaeologists and historians and things of that nature can support Native authors is understanding that we're contemporary people. We are still here, we still exist, and you can support us in the present day. So I would just like to add that from my personal experience. Okay, our question out here.
Yeah, hi, I want to thank you all for coming together like this, and I've enjoyed the experience of listening to your thoughts, your process, and your feelings. I am wondering if you guys would like to share, I'm assuming you haven't come together like this before, so I'm wondering how you guys feel about being here, listening to each other as writers.
It's always wonderful to be in community with other Indigenous authors. Since we are a minority, we always congregate together, and I always feel like I'm part of a family. It's a lot of fun.
Just being with other authors is fun because we have a solitary job, so much of it is just behind the computer. And even when we're on virtual events and giving, talks and all, it's not the same as coming together in person and getting to see everyone's beautiful smiles and all. So this is a joy to be here.
Totally soul feeding. It
Nourishing.
feeds my soul to be with these women. They're awesome. So.
And so I first met Kim. We were roommates at a native writers retreat called Loonsong Turtle Island. And that was the first time that I had met Kim. I met your cousin Stacy at that same retreat, and then we gathered together a few months later at a writers conference called Quayle, Color of Children's Literature, and that's where I met Andrea for the first time. This is my first time meeting you, but I knew of your cousin. It's a small world, and I think that what we want is we want Indigenous literature to be a movement and not a moment. And the best way to do that is to lift up everybody's voices and, cheer on these incredible stories and storytellers. And the days of gatekeeping are over. And so I just encourage people who have a story to tell. There has never been a better time to be an Indigenous storyteller and to find your community.
I mean, there are 570 federally recognized tribes now. What are we up to? Or down to? What are we?
574.
574. All right, and then there are all these people who are more than one tribe, like legitimately, not just like, oh, I'm blah blah blah.
And state historic.
And yes, and so there are so many stories out there that need told, and we're nowhere near reaching that. I mean, and I can't remember what year it was, but before 2018, there was some survey, and it was basically like there was Louise Erdrich, Stephen Graham Jones, Sherman Alexie, and who am I leaving out? Leslie Marmon Silko. And Vine Deloria. I mean, it was like the Blackfeet were represented, the Spokane Coeur d'Alene were represented, the Ojibwe Turtle Mountain were represented, and I'm forgetting somebody. But, I mean, there were only 4 tribes represented by the big publishers for a very long time. But we're still nowhere near that 574 number. So tell your stories.
Seems like there's a lot of love up here. Thank you all. Do we have any more final questions from the audience? Oh, we got one more.
Sorry. I myself aspire to be an author one day at some point. I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you so much. You all inspire me so much. But I know that that it can be hard to keep motivation for writing. Do you all have any tips?
Only share your work with people who want you to succeed.
Don't be stressed by the mantra of you have to write every day or you're not a writer. That's something that has been just pounded out there. And I do believe, especially as a full-time author myself, that, I can't just write when I'm inspired. That's when I like to write, is whenever I'm inspired. But you do have to hunker down even when the words aren't coming very, very well and you're just battling through. Sometimes taking a break is a good thing. And for me, usually when I get past that 500 words, then I'm off to the races when I'm in a writing session. But that's not an everyday thing. I'm more of a seasonal writer, so I may write for 2 or 3 months and then not write for a while. I'm in a season right now where I'm not really writing. I just finished, I published 3 books this year, so I'm just kind of resting. I'm in between books, and so don't let that pressure. People say you have to write every day, or you're not a writer, or that you'll fall out of practice. And you do want to exercise your writing muscles, but, again, just don't let that stress you.
And I think for me, some of the best advice I could give is to practice self-care. Life gets in the way, and it especially gets in the way of being creative. We have deaths in the family, we have sicknesses. There are all kinds of things that happen, and I've learned to give myself grace and practice a lot of self-care. I think getting a massage is wonderful. I think drinking wine is great, Also taking walks. I connect to nature so much, and like I talked about before, when I went to the beach by myself and stood there, that is one of my most sacred places. I feel closest to the Creator when I'm on the beach. And so doing those things, practicing self-care, really helps fuel your creativity.
I would say just wait till you're 21 to start drinking wine.
Yes, please do. Just drink soda and water till then.
Right.
Tea, hot tea, cedar tea.
And motivation, go to places that inspire you. I go to the library, I go to the bookstore, and just walking up and down the shelves is motivating and inspiring.
And I would also say, just make sure, I learned more from reading Louise Erdrich and Stephen Graham Jones and Victor Laval about writing than I did in any class.
Good advice. Thank you. Any other questions out there in the giant audience that we have? Okay, right over here.
Hi, so could each of you give me, or all of us, your favorite book recommendations by Native authors, or just Native authors in general?
My favorite book in this universe is The Marrow Thieves by Cherie Dimaline. It made me feel every human emotion that's possible. The good, the bad, just everything.
I'm going to jump in with The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones.
I'm going to say Native books are like my children. I can't choose one. So every single one of these ladies' books, I recommend.
That's so sweet.
Wow, that's a tough one. I'm just going to go back to the earliest ones that I read was Tim Tingle, our foremost Choctaw storyteller, and his book, The House of Purple Cedar. Incredible inspiration for me whenever I was starting my Choctaw Tribune series.
Thank you. All right, I think we're going to wrap up. Like I said,
I also love Marcy Rendon.
Oh,
I gotta say that.
Marcy Rendon's amazing.
I think Marcy Rendon is the most underrated Indigenous author out there. She should be like headlining everywhere.
She should be making a killing, not a living.
She's phenomenal. And when I handed her first book to my dad, he said, she writes the way Anishinaabe people see the world. And yeah, she's underrated, and I adore her.
Thank you. All right, so we're going to wrap up. Like I said, we're going to have these wonderful authors out here at the book table for signing. Heather's got some more books for you to buy from Green Feather Books, and we really appreciate everybody coming out tonight for this wonderful author event. Thank you so much.